Manhattan, New York, Saturday afternoon. October 10th, 1964, at exactly 2:47 p.m. The brass and glass doors of Bergman and Sterling swung open on Fifth Avenue, a store that had built its reputation serving Manhattan's wealthiest families, and had only recently and reluctantly begun allowing black customers through its doors. 3 months earlier, the Civil Rights Act had been signed into law. On paper, segregation was over. Discrimination in public accommodations was illegal. America had declared itself changed, but law does not instantly rewrite attitudes. And Fifth Avenue still belonged to those who believed it never would. May Johnson, 58 years old, stepped inside first. She moved with quiet confidence, dressed in a tailored navy suit, pearl earrings catching the light. On her arm hung a leather handbag worth more than most Harlem families earned in months. Beside her walked her daughter, Ruthie Johnson, 29, elegant, composed, wearing a cream-colored dress and white gloves, her hair perfectly styled. They didn't enter loudly. They didn't seek attention. They didn't need to. They browsed imported fabrics and designer gowns with the ease of women who knew quality and could afford it. For nearly 15 minutes, nothing happened. A young white sales clerk, nervous but professional, showed them selections from the fall collection. Prices were discussed calmly, fabrics were examined, styles debated. The only signs of tension were the looks. White customers glanced over, some curious, some uncomfortable, some openly displeased. No one said anything. In October 1964, open discrimination had become dangerous. Not illegal in practice, everywhere, but risky. Most people had learned to keep their hatred quiet, until Charles Whitfield Peton III walked in at 3:02 p.m. Peton was 64 years old, a real estate developer whose wealth was old, inherited, and multiplied. He owned 19 buildings in Manhattan, sat on bank boards, belonged to exclusive clubs. A man accustomed to bending rules and people to his will, he entered Bergman and Sterling, expecting to collect custom-tailored suits. Instead, he saw something that made his blood boil. 2 well-dressed black women being served by a white clerk. Witnesses later described his reaction as instantaneous. His face flushed red, his jaw tightened, his posture stiffened, not with surprise, but with fury. To Peton, this wasn't progress. It was contamination. He strode across the store, his voice rising with every step. By the time he reached them, he was shouting. The words he used were too vile to print verbatim. Racial slurs, accusations, declarations that black people had no place in stores meant for white society. Claims that the Civil Rights Act was communist legislation destroying America. Threats to have the women arrested. Accusations that they must have stolen their money because, in his mind, black people could not afford luxury. Honestly, customers froze. No one intervened. The clerk stood paralyzed. Peton didn't stop. He grabbed a dress Ruthie had been examining her. $650 French silk gown, and threw it onto the floor. Ruined, he shouted. Contaminated. He demanded the store manager. Threatened to withdraw his business. Demanded the store return to its old policies. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. It felt like an hour. May and Ruthie didn't shout back. They didn't argue. They stood silently, absorbing every insult, trying to preserve the last thing Peton couldn't take from them, their dignity. Ruthie began to cry. And still, no one stepped in. Finally, May took her daughter's hand. Together, they walked toward the door, heads high, backs straight, tears falling but composure intact. Peton followed them, still shouting, all the way to the entrance. "This isn't your neighborhood," he yelled. "The law doesn't change." Reality. The doors closed behind them. On the sidewalk, Fifth Avenue continued as if nothing had happened. Taxis passed. Shoppers walked by. Inside the store, customers slowly resumed, browsing relieved. The scene was over. But what no one inside Bergman and Sterling understood was this. Those 2 women were not powerless. They were the wife and daughter of a man whose name carried weight. Far beyond Harlem. A man who had learnt long ago that real power wasn't loud or violent. or impulsive. It was patient, calculated, and devastating when unleashed. Charles Patton believed himself untouchable. A wealthy man who had spoken the truth as he saw it. Confident the world still bent his way. He had no idea that in humiliating 2 women that afternoon, he had crossed a line that would cost him everything. And New York was about to learn what happens when arrogance meets consequence. What Charles Patton did not know, what no one in Bergman and Sterling knew that afternoon, was that the 2 women he had just publicly humiliated were not strangers passing through his world. They were connected to a man whose world operated by very different rules. 90 minutes after leaving Fifth Avenue, May Johnson and her daughter Ruthie arrived back in Harlem. The car pulled up outside a modest building on 125th Street. Above the palm calf, a place that looked unremarkable to outsiders, but was known by anyone who mattered north of Central Park. This was where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson kept his office. May tried to steady herself as they climbed the stairs. She had lived her entire life knowing what racism looked like. She had learned long ago that surviving it often meant swallowing anger and moving on. She didn't want to trouble her husband, not now, not after everything he'd already endured. But Ruthie couldn't hold it together. The moment she saw her father, the composure she had clung to since leaving the store shattered. Tears came hard and uncontrollably. The words spilled out in fragments about the man, the shouting, the slurs, the way no one helped, the way it felt to stand there while strangers watched her dignity be torn apart. Bumpy Johnson didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't pace the room. He sat perfectly still, listening. Those who knew him understood what that silence meant. Bumpy Johnson was warm with his family, protective, gentle in ways few people ever saw. But when someone harmed what he loved, something inside him went cold, focused, disciplined, precise. May tried to minimize what had happened. "It's nothing," she said quietly. "Just another unpleasant encounter. You know how it is." But Bumpy already knew this was different. When Ruthie finished, the room went quiet again. The only sound was the traffic outside, and Ruthie's breathing slowly, steadied. Then Bumpy asked a single question. "Did anyone get his name?" May shook her head. They hadn't thought to ask. They'd just wanted to leave. But she remembered something the store manager had called him Mr. Patton. He had talked about owning buildings in Manhattan, about being a regular customer, about power. That was enough. Bumpy nodded once. "Go home," he said calmly. "Take care of Ruthie. Don't worry about this anymore." There was no anger in his voice, no threat, no promise, just for words that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "I'll handle it." May hesitated. She knew her husband. She understood what those words meant. Not violence, not recklessness, but certainty. She took Ruthie's hand, and together they left. The moment the door closed behind them, Bumpy Johnson began to work. Over the next hour, the phone on his desk never stopped ringing. Calls went out to attorneys, business contacts, bankers, and people who specialized in knowing things quietly, discreetly, efficiently. By early evening, Bumpy knew exactly who Charles Whitfield Patton III was. A real estate developer worth tens of millions on paper, leveraged to the edge, dependent on bank financing, entangled in partnerships, vulnerable in ways Patton himself had never bothered to consider. Most importantly, Bumpy understood the moment they were living in. October 1964 was not 1954. The Civil Rights Act had changed. The rules. Racism wasn't just immoral, net was expensive, dangerous, a liability. And Charles Patton had just put his hatred on full public display. 3 months after the law had been signed, that made him exposed. Bumpy Johnson didn't believe in impulsive revenge. He believed in proportion, in lessons that couldn't be ignored, in consequences that echoed. What Patton had done was not a private insult whispered behind closed doors. It was a public act of humiliation meant to remind to black women of their place. So Bumpy would respond publicly, without lifting a hand, without breaking the law, without leaving fingerprints. By the time night fell over Harlem, the plan was already taking shape. Charles Petain believed himself untouchable. A man shielded by wealth, status, and habit. He had mistaken silence for weakness, dignity for submission. He had no idea that in those 5 minutes inside a Fifth Avenue boutique, he had triggered a response that could not be stopped. The story. It was no longer about women being humiliated. It was about how power was about to change hands, and the clock had started ticking. Bumpy Johnson did not sleep much that Saturday night, not because he was angry, but because there was work to do. Revenge, when rushed, leaves evidence. But consequences, when planned carefully, leave nothing behind except results. By early evening, on October 10th, Bumpy had already identified Charles Whitfield, Petain 3, by midnight. He knew far more than Petain ever imagined anyone outside his social circle could know. Petain's fortune looked formidable from the outside. 19 buildings, development projects across Manhattan, board seats at banks, country club memberships. Newspapers called him a pillar of the business community. But Bumpy understood something Petain did not. Power built on leverage is fragile. Petain's empire was financed with borrowed money. He had expanded aggressively, stacking loan upon loan, betting that banks would always roll his debt forward. As long as confidence remained, the structure held. Lose confidence, then the entire thing collapsed. That was the vulnerability. And October 1964 was the worst possible time for a man like Petain to be exposed. The Civil Rights Act had passed just 3 months earlier. Banks, corporations, and institutions were suddenly sensitive to appearances. No one wanted to be associated with public racism. No one wanted headlines suggesting complicity in discrimination. Risk departments had learned a new word: reputation. Bumpy understood this shift instinctively. He had spent decades navigating systems designed to exclude him. He knew how white power actually functioned, not through brute force, but through networks, comfort, and mutual protection. And he knew how quickly those networks dissolved when someone became a liability. So the plan wasn't to attack Petain directly. It was to let Petain's own behavior destroy him. The first calls went to attorneys and financial contacts people who could speak the language banks respected. No threats were made, no lies were told. Only facts were gathered, organized, and framed correctly. By Sunday morning, Bumpy had a clear picture. Petain was highly leveraged. Several projects were behind schedule. Cost overruns were mounting. Cash reserves were thin. Everything depended on continued bank confidence. That confidence was about to evaporate. Through intermediaries, detailed financial analyses were prepared. Not exaggerations. Not fabrications. Just clean, accurate summaries that highlighted risk emphasizing. How dependent Petain was on favorable conditions, continuing unchanged, and conditions had changed. Included in those summaries was one crucial detail. Petain's public racist outburst at a Fifth Avenue boutique on October 10th, witnessed by multiple customers and employees. No accusations, no commentary, just documentation. The implication was obvious. Any bank continuing to support Petain was now exposed, not just financially, but publicly. In a post-Civil Rights Act world that mattered. By Sunday afternoon, those analyses reached loan officers at 3 banks heavily invested in Petain's projects. No one told them what to do. They didn't need to be told. Banks exist to manage risk. And suddenly Petain looked like risk incarnate. At the same time, another channel was activated. Bumpy Johnson had long supported civil rights organizations quietly, not because it bought him forgiveness, but because he believed in leverage. Civil rights groups understood protest, understood pressure, understood how to make injustice visible without crossing legal lines. Through trusted intermediaries, leaders from several organizations were informed about Petain's behavior, about his history of refusing to rent to black families, about the Fifth Avenue incident. The information was verifiable. Witnesses existed. Paper trails were real. Bumpy offered support but no control. Funding for organizing, for printing, for legal consultation. No demands, no instructions, just resources. That distinction mattered. What followed would be legitimate activism, not retaliation. Lawful pressure, not intimidation. Meanwhile, Peyton's business partners began receiving phone calls, not threats, just conversations, quiet ones. Are you aware of what's happening? Have you seen the papers? Do you understand how this might affect your own reputation? Partners invest for profit, but they stay for stability. And suddenly, stability was gone. Within hours, Peyton's name was being discussed in rooms he wasn't invited into. Risk assessments were being revised. Exit strategies quietly explored. Dogpet on, meanwhile, was unaware of any of this. He spent Sunday believing the incident at Bergman and Sterling was over. Just another outburst. Another reminder of how things used to be. He did not understand that in 1964, silence no longer meant acceptance. It meant preparation. By Sunday night, the pieces were in motion. Banks were uneasy. Partners were nervous. Activists were organizing. Journalists were asking questions, and none of it could be traced back to Bumpy Johnson. That was the brilliance. No single action was illegal. No single move was aggressive. Each step, on its own, was reasonable. Together, they were devastating. Bumpy Johnson wasn't interested in humiliation for its own sake. He was interested in permanence. Baton had used his social power to strip two women of dignity in public, so Bumpy would use social and economic power to strip Peyton of the illusion that he was untouchable, and the timing could not have been more precise. Had this happened 10 years earlier, banks might have ignored it, clubs might have closed ranks, newspapers might have buried the story. But October 1964 was different. The law had shifted. The optics had changed. Institutions were scrambling to appear compliant, progressive, responsible. Peyton had made himself radioactive at exactly the wrong moment. By early Monday morning, the pressure was no longer theoretical. Loan reviews were initiated. Meetings were scheduled. Protest permits were filed. Stories were drafted. All before Peyton even realized he was under scrutiny. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Bumpy Johnson had not raised his voice, had not threatened anyone, had not ordered a single act of violence. He had simply understood the system better than the man who thought he owned it. And as Monday dawned over Manhattan, Charles Peyton's empire built over decades stood, balanced on a foundation that was already cracking. The next 72 hours would decide everything, and there would be no way to stop what was coming. Monday morning, October 12, 1964, arrived quietly in Manhattan. There were no sirens, no headlines yet, no confrontation, just phone calls. At 9:12 a.m., Charles Peyton's office received the first one. A polite voice from a bank he had worked with 4 years requested a routine review of his outstanding loans. Nothing unusual, they said. Just due diligence. By 9:47 a.m. A second bank called by 10:30 a.m. A third. Individually, the calls meant nothing. Together, they meant everything. Banks do not panic, but they do reassess. And reassessment is deadly to a man whose empire exists on borrowed confidence. By noon, Peyton's finance team was scrambling to produce documents, projections, reassurances. Meetings were scheduled, explanations rehearsed. But the tone had changed. The questions were sharper now. Not just about cash flow and timelines, but about reputation, about protests, about newspapers asking questions, about whether continuing to do business with Peyton exposed the banks themselves to risk in a post-Civil Rights Act world. By Monday afternoon, Peyton's name was no longer a neutral entry in a ledger. It was a liability. That same morning, the protests began. Outside Peyton's largest residential building on West 86th Street, roughly 50 demonstrators gathered on the public sidewalk. Their signs were simple, their language precise. Racist landlord violates civil rights. Justice has no exceptions. Discrimination is illegal. They blocked nothing, threatened no one, They handed out flyers documenting Peton's history of refusing black tenants, describing the Fifth Avenue incident, quoting the Civil Rights Act itself. The optics were devastating. Tenants peered from windows. Passers-by stopped to read. Photographers took pictures. A few reporters asked questions. By early afternoon, similar protests appeared at 2 more Peton properties. Nothing illegal. Nothing aggressive. Just visibility. And visibility is poison to a man who depends on silence. Meanwhile, Peton's business partners were receiving calls of their own. Not from activists. Not from protesters. From friends. From advisors. From people who cared about their own reputations. Have you seen what's happening? Are you comfortable being associated with this? Do you know how this could affect the project? Partners don't abandon ship because of morals. They leave because of risk. And suddenly, every deal connected to Peton felt unstable. By late Monday afternoon, 2 partners requested urgent meetings. One asked about exit options. Another raised concerns about lenders losing confidence. Peton reassured them, promised everything was under control, claimed the protests would fade, but he sounded defensive. That night, the first newspaper stories ran. Black newspapers led with clear direct headlines, describing a racist confrontation at a Fifth Avenue boutique. White newspapers followed more cautiously, framing it as an allegation, a dispute, a sign of tension in a changing city. But the effect was the same. Peton's name was now searchable, discussed, connected to racism at exactly the wrong historical moment. By Tuesday morning, the banks moved. 2 of the 3 institutions reviewing Peton's loans exercised clauses buried deep in their agreements. Clauses allowing them to demand immediate repayment if a borrower's financial condition deteriorated or if reputational risk threatened the lender. The total, $9 million. Due immediately. Peton did not have $9 million in liquid assets. He had buildings, paper wealth, long-term projections. But banks don't accept promises when confidence is gone. The calls came in quick succession. Formal, polite, unyielding. Peton tried to negotiate, asked for extensions, offered collateral. The answer was no. By midday Tuesday, he was facing forced sales, quick ones, at bad prices. At the same time, for business partners formally withdrew from joint projects. Each cited different reasons: risk exposure, negative publicity, concern about financing, but the message was unmistakable. They were gone that afternoon. Another blow landed. Tenants from 9 of Peton's buildings gathered at a Harlem church and formed a tenant organization. For years, many had tolerated poor maintenance and aggressive rent increases because they had no leverage. Now they did. They announced a rent strike payments would go into escrow accounts until conditions improved. And discriminatory practices ended. Lawyers were involved. Media was present. The strike affected tens of thousands of dollars per month. More importantly, it created legal headaches Peton couldn't ignore. Evictions would be contested. Inspections demanded. Every shortcut exposed. His operating margins collapsed as if that weren't enough. Peton's social world began to vanish. Invitations stopped coming. Dinner plans were cancelled. Phone calls went unanswered. People who had laughed with him weeks earlier were suddenly too busy. In private, some disapproved of his behavior. Others didn't care about the racism, but cared deeply about the spectacle, about the embarrassment, about being associated with someone who had lost control in public in 1964. Discretion was currency. Peton had spent it all. Then came the clubs. One exclusive country club quietly asked him to resign, citing the desire to avoid controversy. Another placed his membership under review, pending investigation. Within days, he was out of both. By Wednesday morning, October 14th, Charles Peton had not slept in nearly 48 hours. He sat in his midtown office surrounded by documents. Phones ringing constantly, advisors offering conflicting advice. His tie was loosened, his suit wrinkled. The confidence he had carried for decades was gone. He made frantic calls to bankers, to partners, to friends. What's happening? Who did this? Why now? The answers were vague but consistent. The incident, the protests, the papers, the timing. The world had changed. Then he hadn't. Peyton believed this was chaos. Bad luck. A coincidence of pressures. He did not yet understand that none of it was random. That every lever had been pulled deliberately, legally, and in sequence. That his collapse was not an explosion. It was a controlled demolition. And as Wednesday wore on, with no relief in sight, Charles Peyton began to understand the truth that had never occurred to him before. Power no longer belonged to men who could humiliate others without consequence. It belonged to those who understood how the system actually worked. By the end of that day, his empire was already beyond saving, and he still had no idea who had orchestrated its destruction. Not yet. By Wednesday afternoon, October 14th, 1964, Charles Peyton's world was no longer collapsing. It had already collapsed what he didn't understand. What finally pushed him from confusion into terror was why it had happened so quickly, so completely. And from every direction at once. That answer arrived at 2:30 p.m. Mann introduced himself at Peyton's Midtown office as an attorney representing certain Harlem business interests. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't gloat. He simply explained. Last Saturday, Peyton had publicly humiliated two black women in a Fifth Avenue boutique. He had screamed racist abuse at them. He had thrown merchandise on the floor. He had declared the Civil Rights Act meaningless. Those two women, the lawyer said calmly, were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. What had happened? Since the bank loan calls, the partner withdrawals, the protests, the tenant organizing, the media attention, the country club expulsions was not coincidence. It was consequence. Peyton reportedly went pale. He tried to dismiss it, claimed Johnson was a criminal, newly released from prison, incapable of influencing banks, civil rights groups, or elite institutions. The lawyer corrected him. Power, he explained, doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't need to shout. And in October 1964, power didn't look like violence. It looked like coordination. Peyton asked what he could do to make it stop, how he could fix it. The answer was simple. Nothing. The damage was already done. The lesson had already been taught, and Peyton, for the first time in his life, understood the price of his racism. 3 days later, on Saturday afternoon, May and Ruthie Johnson returned to Bergman and Sterling. This time, everything was different. The store manager greeted them personally, apologizing repeatedly for what had happened the week before. He assured them that Charles Peyton was permanently banned from the premises. Sales clerks attended to them with care and courtesy. Other customers, some of whom had watched silently during the original incident, went out of their way to be polite. For 90 minutes. May and Ruthie shopped freely, safely, and with respect, when they left the store carrying their purchases. Civil rights observers standing outside applauded quietly. Not in celebration, but in recognition. Something had changed. Charles Peyton never recovered. Within months, he was forced to sell most of his properties at steep losses. His net worth collapsed. His social circle vanished. His marriage fell apart. He died a few years later, largely forgotten by the world that had once protected him. But the impact of his fall extended far beyond one man. Across Manhattan, businesses took notice. Stores that had quietly resisted integration began complying fully. Landlords adjusted policies. Banks recalculated risk, not just financial, but moral and legal. The Civil Rights Act had teeth now, not because the law existed, but because people understood how to enforce it. And that was the real lesson of October. 1964. Power no longer belonged to those who could insult without consequence. It belonged to those who knew how to make the law hurt. And once that lesson was learned, New York was never quite the same again.